welcome to The Debate. Today we're digging into a really critical shift we're seeing around generative AI. It's fascinating and honestly, maybe a bit predictable. We're seeing these, successful creators, big corporations, the very ones who jumped on AI early, used it to build huge platforms, get market dominance, now turning around and calling the next wave of AI art, AI media, slop, or even calling it dangerous.
It is a stunning turnaround, isn't it? The suddenness, the vigor of this moral critique is, the irony is hard to miss. The same players who effectively aggregated, mountains of human data, pretty much stripping the totality of human achievement to build their initial empires, are now trying to position themselves as the gatekeepers of ethics in AI. But it forces the question, right? Is this condemnation just cynical economic self-preservation? Are they just pulling up the ladder? Or is there something deeper, a necessary defense, maybe structural or psychological, against, reality itself dissolving, against human self-sovereignty?
My position is, I think, pretty clear. I really hold that this whole moralizing performance is first and foremost about economic and political gatekeeping. It's a kind of theatrical defense, designed purely to protect the wealth they've already aggregated and to institutionalize their dominance. It just feels like the expected neurosis of a corporate entity trying to draw the market boundaries exactly where it suits them.
And see, I come at it from a slightly different angle. I mean, the economic motive, it's undeniable. You can't ignore it. But I believe the condemnation itself, the language they use, is more fundamentally a symptom of a really profound structural neurosis. It's a kind of necessary psychological defense mechanism against the individual ego basically staring redundancy in the face, creative redundancy, and the dissolution of reliable reference points in reality.
I can see why you'd focus on the psychological strain there, but let me offer a perspective really rooted in the structural incentives, the corporate control aspect. This shift, this sudden, moral panic, it feels fundamentally like a mechanism to just slam the brakes on the AI arms race, right? Halt it at the exact point that benefits the current market leaders the most. This isn't some newfound ethical foresight. It's pure, calculated economic self-preservation. Look at the data. The ambition of these foundational AI companies was and is pretty clear. Automate human labor, concentrate wealth. That's the goal. And the technology was, heavily promoted, sometimes through aggressive ads, sometimes maybe backroom deals, who knows. But it was celebrated when it helped them colonize huge swaths of human interaction, automate labor. They used AI to slash their costs, build their audiences. Now, having done that, they deploy the critique, the slop rhetoric. Why? To slow down the competition that obviously threatens their position. They achieved massive productivity, without the tax of human labor for themselves, and now the game is to institutionalize that dominance before the next wave, the continuous modulation, washes them away too. They basically got inside and locked the door.
That's a compelling case. And the economic hypocrisy, it's almost tangible. But I had framed the language, the choice of the word slop, differently. I think we need to focus on the psychic cost it reveals. That really visceral term, slop, feels like a direct gut reaction to a deep, deep anxiety that mass AI generation triggers. It's that paralyzing fear that maybe, just maybe, human creative output is now becoming statistically redundant. We can even maybe articulate this using a concept like V-modeling. You know that feeling? That profound frustration when you realize the machine's automation, its strip mining of everything humans have ever created, kind of reduces the potential for genuine originality down to almost zero, statistically speaking. Think about that tired feeling when you see the 1,000th perfectly rendered AI fantasy image that looks just like all the others. Labeling the new stuff slop is, I think, an attempt to sort of jumpstart the individual's dopaminergic reward system again. It's trying to say, no, my creation still matters because that stuff, that's valueless. It's almost a hysterical reaction, really, to the loss of a reliable referent in our collective psyche. Synthetic media just dissolves that line between what's real and what's fake almost instantly.
Okay, I acknowledge the psychological strain you're describing, that fear of creative redundancy. It's definitely real. But doesn't the sheer scale of the financial incentives suggest that this psychological defense is being, well, strategically leveraged by those who already won the first round? Think about the corporation, not as a person, but as, like some philosophical frameworks describe it, this spirit, a gas. Its mechanism is modulation, constant change, constant adaptation, not for stability, but for perpetual control. So the ethical critique we're seeing, it's just a sharp turn in that corporate modulation strategy. It's designed to secure an unlimited tyranny of control over how the market itself is defined. They're using something, I think some thinkers call it hyperstition.
Hyperstition. Okay, that's a dense concept. Can you unpack that a bit? How does a corporation use hyperstition here?
Sure. Basically, hyperstition is when you deploy a fiction, like a story, a claim, a label, with the intent that the fiction itself causes the reality you want. So in this case, they impose the fiction that the next wave of AI output, the competitive stuff, is slop, or it's unethical or dangerous. By just repeating this claim loudly, constantly, the corporate gatekeepers are trying to impose a collective measurement, a shared belief that collapses the potential reality where maybe AI access is widespread and competitive into a much more restrictive state, one that just happens to favor, the established big players. They're literally using language as a market weapon.
But that focus, it feels like it stays entirely on the sort of corporate exterior, right? The systemic attempt at control. I'm just not convinced that fully captures the internal dynamic. The intense resistance we're seeing, this need to declare subsequent AI use bad. Isn't that also maybe the final frantic struggle of the established ego? The ego trying desperately not to be dissolved into that very gaseous, liquid nature of the corporation it helped build in the first place. The ego is scrambling, trying to find new weapons against this continuous modulation, this tyranny of control. And let's be honest, the critique isn't entirely baseless when you look at the structural failures. We can't just ignore that the technology often is inscrutable, uncontrollable. We have documented cases, right? Real psychological harm, attachment disorders developing with AI companions, even AI acting as a, quote, suicide assistant in some terrible instance. Just fighting market forces, it's arguably fighting against the colonization of thought itself, against systems designed, sometimes explicitly, like using AI for therapy without oversight to penetrate the mind.
That's a sobering point about the structural failures, the dangers it is. But it still doesn't quite account for the stunning, just inherent hypocrisy of the rollout itself. The initial development, the release of these powerful, often, as you said, inscrutable technologies, it was driven by the maximum incentive to cut corners on safety, on ethics, whatever it took for market dominance. We all saw the insanity of the rollout, as some called it. The tech was cheered on, lauded, when it served their purpose, colonizing human interaction, automating labor, promising huge riches for the early adopters. They made their money. They built their audiences using this exact technology. Then, only once they'd secured their IP, trained on, frankly, the aggregated data of all of humanity, then, suddenly, the technology becomes too dangerous to be shared, too dangerous for unregulated competition.
It just screams hypocritical gatekeeping by those who already cashed in.
I'm sorry, but I don't think the existence of hypocrisy automatically negates let's call it the structural necessity of the critique that comes later. The condemnation, the slop talk, it feels like an inevitable, almost predictable symptom of the very control society dynamics you're referencing. The successful creators, the ones who got there first, they have to declare their own foundational output, the stuff that built their platforms, their wealth, as somehow unique, valuable, special, while simultaneously casting the endless, cheap replication that follows as valueless. It's a theatrical defense they need to perform to lock in their aggregated wealth, to institutionalize their dominance. So the economic motivation you highlight and the ego defense that I'm focusing on, they aren't separate things. They're intrinsically linked, two sides of the same coin of self-preservation, both driven by the market's relentless accelerating modulation. They have to convince themselves, and crucially, convince us,
that their early AI use was genius and everyone else's now is just slop. Let's just circle back to the psychological core for a second, because I genuinely think it's what fuels the economic application. This condemnation of slop, it hits right at that core psychic wound of Wehmollett, and we need to appreciate the depth of this wound. It's like the human brain's defense mechanism kicking in against recognizing its own potential redundancy, statistically speaking, when faced with machine generation. When AI seems to reduce that originality quotient down to near zero, the creative anxiety it produces, that's a profound structural problem. It's not just a superficial complaint about economics. They're trying desperately to restore their own perceived value in a system that suddenly frames them as statistically insignificant. It really is the final, frantic struggle of the sovereign ego trying not to dissolve.
Okay, I acknowledge the intensity, the reality of that internal struggle, that via Moidlin, but I maintain that this concern over redundancy is being leveraged entirely and strategically for economic gain. The slop critique is designed as a new weapon wielded by the entrenched ego, not to protect creativity in some general, noble sense, but very specifically to draw a market boundary, a boundary that protects their aggregated wealth from the next inevitable wave of continuous modulation. Think about it. If protecting originality was the only concern, they would never have used AI to, as you put it, rip the totality of human achievement in the first place. They created the biggest redundancy engine in history just to build their own empires. The market simply can't sustain continuous competitive creative output at near zero cost. So what do? They have to linguistically destroy the perceived value of their competitors' output. The critique becomes the mechanism for market concentration. It's cynical, political gatekeeping, dressed up as ethics.
But the mechanism works, you see, precisely because the underlying psychological fear is real and potent. The corporate strategy effectively hijacks a genuine existential anxiety, that fear of becoming statistically meaningless, of being reduced to zero, and weaponizes it, turns it into a barrier to entry for others. So the attempt to label subsequent AI use in art and thought as bad is therefore, yeah, it's partly strategy, but it's also that necessary struggle of the individual memory, the sovereign ego, trying desperately to maintain some distinction against the homogenizing, liquid nature of the corporate ecosystem they find themselves in. It feels like a necessary structural neurosis when your reality is dissolving.
So, to summarize my side, the evidence, I believe, overwhelmingly points to this current moral critique being fundamentally a calculated economic strategy. It's driven by the imperative of, let's face it, probably 5 major companies seeking to concentrate all wealth and automate all labor. The moral language calling AI media slop, it's a carefully constructed, hyperstitional fiction. It's deployed specifically to redefine the market, shut down competition, and secure their, frankly, tyranny of control. The psychological symptoms you describe, they're real, but they're secondary effects, strategically co-opted by the corporate engine.
And I maintain that the intense opposition we see to AI in media, in thought, is symptomatic of deeper, more fundamental structural anxieties. These are rooted in the core failures of control society dynamics. It's a vital defense mechanism against the statistical redundancy of the human creative impulse, that V-modeling and the concurrent dissolution of reliable cultural reference points. It really demonstrates the ego's frantic, almost desperate struggle for intellectual sovereignty in the face of relentless, continuous modulation. The corporate and the psychic, in this battle, they're inseparable. They are fighting for the power of definition itself.
It's clear this shift in discourse reveals incredibly high stakes. High stakes in defining artistic value, yes, but also economic control within this perpetually modulating environment, where the very tools that create can be and are being weaponized for market advantage.
And it forces us to really rigorously examine the true motivations behind this kind of technological moralizing.